So I recently found 4 yards of this white lace fabric that I bought at Walmart on sale back in the days that we could just peruse the fabric section at Walmart. And I had totally forgotten about it, but I found it, and it's going to be the basis for my next project. So I also have these green scraps from when I made a dress, these green scraps from when I made a vest for my brother-in-law, once again to be the characters of Little Women, and these pieces of white cotton that I cut out of a sheet I bought at Target when I was making an 1860s petticoat. So all of these together are going to be the foundation for my next project. We're also going to be playing a fun little game today called How Long Can I Last With My Hair Down, because I almost never wear my hair down when I'm sewing because it gets in the way. But I thought this headband went really well with my outfit today, so I wanted to try to wear it. So we'll see how long until I break and put in a scrunchie. It's 3:35 right now. Let's start the timer.
So what I'm doing here is laying out the skirt fabric to cut out my circle skirt. I knew that I wanted it to be really full, so I was actually going to make 2 circles and have the final waist measurement be a little bit larger than my actual waist so that it could gather a little bit. Also, I swear I'm not texting here. I'm actually using my phone to Google circle skirt chart, which is something I do literally every single time I make a circle skirt, and it just tells you how many inches away you should mark your waist measurement from the corner of your fabric, depending on how big your waist is. Did a lot of debating and going back and forth about the best way to lay it out and cut it out to have the most full skirt possible while still having enough fabric left over to do the bodice and the sleeves as poofy as I wanted. And in the end, I decided to fold it over 8 times and then cut it out with 2.5 inches for the waist and 30 inches for the final hemline. And I just sort of laid the measuring tape down and cut next to it, and you really should mark it with pins or with a fabric marker, but I didn't. Then I had these 2 circles, and I just used the lines of the fabric to guide me in cutting 2 straight lines to open them up so that they could be sewn to each other to make one skirt later. Next, I cut out pieces of the white cotton to be the lining, and I just used an A-line skirt pattern I had on hand from another pattern, and I cut it out 6 times. And I used these books as pattern weights because I didn't feel like pinning it all down. Now, you can buy an actual product called pattern weights, but why would you do that if you have books?
So when I'm making a garment like this one that isn't a historical reconstruction, it's just more for fun, a lot of times I'll start by going through my pattern collection, which I just keep here in this gallon-sized Ziploc bag, and seeing if there's anything close to what I want to make, and then I'll just take that and alter it instead of having to make a completely new pattern. So for this project, I'm actually going to use both of the bodice patterns from this Simplicity set that I've had since freshman year of college. I've had this for like 4 years, and I've made it in a bunch of different variations and used it to be the base of a bunch of different costumes or dresses. If you don't have a stash of patterns already, you can easily drape them, or you can download patterns off the internet and just print them on printer paper, cut them out, and tape them together, and those work fine. I just tend to like these a little better because you don't have to do all of the cutting and taping, and you don't have to worry about it potentially printing in the wrong size. That way you just have to do a little extra time to do your due diligence and make sure everything works out, versus if you buy patterns like these, you just know that they're coming in the right size and already as one piece.
The next thing I did was cut out all of my bodice pattern pieces, and I cut along this line that it said you could cut along if you were, quote, petite, and I am not petite, but I have made this pattern before, and it tends to be too long for me as a bodice because I have a very high waist. But I actually regretted cutting it exactly there because it was a little too high in the end, so I would have cut it maybe an inch lower if I had foresight to do that. So if any of you happen to be using your spare time during this quarantine to invent time travel and that works out for you, hit me up so I can go back in time and save myself that extra inch. Now, I cut this out of both green fabrics because one was going to be the outside and one was going to be the lining, and I wanted to use the darker green for the outside because I thought it was prettier, but it's also stretchy, so it's good that the other green is a little sturdier, so it'll keep that green from stretching too much. Next, I cut out another bodice out of the white lace fabric, and I wanted this to be very blousy and gathered, so I actually added a bunch of extra inches in the center front and the center back, and I ignored the darts because they don't matter when you're making things blousy and gathered. Now I'd like to offer you a brief review of these books. This one is called The History of Redheads, and I haven't actually finished it, even though I feel like I should because it's, I don't know, my heritage or something. But Is Everyone Hanging Out Without Me and Other Concerns by Mindy Kaling is really good, and you should check that out, and her other book called Why Not Me? Next, I cut out the sleeves, and I took this sleeve pattern from yet another pattern, and then largely ignored it as I cut them out to be super giant so that they would be really flouncy. Then I ironed all of the white cotton pieces and the inside green pieces. The outside green pieces didn't have any creases, so I didn't have to iron them. Side note, does anybody else love ironing in hotel rooms? Like, every time I'm in a hotel room, I'm like, I have to iron something. It's just here, and it's so convenient. It feels like an amenity and luxurious somehow.
So this is my serger, and a serger is basically a sewing machine with a knife in it, which I know sounds like something out of a child's nightmare, but is actually really awesome because it'll slice along the edge of your fabric, and then it'll use 3 or 4 interconnecting threads to wrap around the edge so that your fabric won't fray anymore. And that's a way to make sure that even if you're not lining your garment, the edges don't fray. So the next thing I'm going to do is serge all of the white pieces that are going on the underskirt. I don't have to serge anything else in this project because lace like this doesn't tend to fray, and the green parts of the bodice are going to be sewn together, so all the raw edges will be on the inside, which means that they won't have the opportunity to fray.
Shout out to my mom who gave me this serger for Christmas a couple of years ago. I think it's probably the greatest gift she's ever given me, except for maybe life itself, but I don't know, I really like the serger. Next, I sewed together all the pieces of the lining bodice, and you'll notice I didn't use any pins here, and that's because I'm kind of a badass, and sometimes I just sew things, but if you don't have a lot of experience, it's probably better to use pins.
So here's a fun thing. I've made 2 right halves of this bodice and 0 left halves. So I now have 2 of these bodices. They're very long, and I'm going to sew them together, right sides together, along both of the sides, which is the center front, really, because this is going to open in the center front, and then along the top, and I'll leave the bottom open, I'll turn it inside out, and then I will top stitch the bottom closed.
I did actually use pins this time because sewing a stretchy fabric to a non-stretchy fabric can sometimes be tricky, and I didn't want it to warp. Next, I struggled to demonstrate for a camera that I was clipping my corners so that they would be crisper when turned inside out. Then I ironed all the lining seams flat. The only reason I didn't iron the seams of the outer fabric flat is that it's a knit and those don't usually iron too well, and it's also not thick enough to cause any real bulk within the bodice. Then I took it over to my machine and I turned inward the bottom edge, and then I top stitched it down so that it was a clean edge just like the top and the sides. I turned the lining in just slightly more than the outside fabric because that forces the outside fabric to expand over the lining so that it's not visible. Then I sewed all the pieces of the lining skirt together, and then I decided to test and see if it fit my waist, and it didn't. So I cut another about 1.5 inches off the top, and then it did just fine. Then I sewed the 2 pieces of the lace skirt together, and then I gathered and pinned it to the lining skirt like this, and then I sewed that down. Then I sewed all the pieces of the lace bodice together, and it can be pretty difficult to pin lace to lace because there's nothing for the pins to really grab onto, but you just have to go slow and take your time, and it never hurts to sacrifice a goat or a virgin or something to Arachne if you have the time. Then I went about gathering the neckline by sewing with a really long stitch along the neckline and then pulling on those threads together and then sewing back across it with a smaller stitch to be sure those gathers were held in place. You can see me occasionally holding it up to myself to make sure that it seems like it's going to be the right length. Also, I was really nervous about doing the sleeves on this because in general I find sleeves to be a pain in the butt, and these were giant and lace, but they actually wound up not being too hard, so maybe all those blood sacrifices paid off after all. Next, I sewed a waistband to the skirt pieces and then folded it over, tucked the edges in and sewed it down again so that all the raw edges from the waistband and the skirt were tucked inside. I didn't film the process of making the waistband because I always just cut out a strip of fabric that seems like it's the right width and then hold it up to my waist, wrap it around, and cut it off when it's long enough. Then I connected the bodice and the skirt by pinning the bodice down on top of the waistband with a lot of gathers and top stitching it along the top and bottom of the waistband. Then I made a line of dots 1 inch apart, near the center front on the lining, and then I took myself and my camera and my stuff to the kitchen to pound some grommets in. Now, I learned that this second stick thingy-majigger was actually a hole puncher from actually reading the instructions after I pounded in grommets last time. And I tried it, but it didn't actually work very well on the jersey knit because it was too stretchy, so I had to go back to using scissors anyway. Next, I hand sewed the side seams of both bodices together. Now, the way this dress closes is actually that the lace bodice has an open side seam and the green bodice opens in the front. So when you close the green bodice over the lace bodice, it effectively closes that side seam. And then when you lace up the green bodice, the whole thing is closed. I also added a hook and bar to the waistband to close up the waistband, and then a button to the skirt, and I was going to do a buttonhole, but then my buttonhole foot on my machine was giving me a lot of trouble, so I actually sewed a little fabric loop onto it to close with the button, which isn't as pretty as I would like, but it's under the lace, so no one really sees. And then it was done, so I put it on and proceeded to twirl about in my living room, and then I decided I needed to take my hair back down for optimum twirling. And the next day it had snowed, so I went outside to get some shots of me modeling it and frolicking about in the snow because when I was cooking up this dress, I really wanted to channel some Sound of Music vibes, so I decided to pretend I was frolicking through the Swiss Alps and or dancing with a handsome naval captain in his enormous mansion. And this is where my neighbors caught me, and I tried to explain what I was doing, but they wouldn't open their door, so they couldn't really hear me.
Our condo neighbors saw me.